Hello, Jess here from All the Sparkle with a pair of bright and cheerful floral cards using products from the brand new Best Days release for Simon Says stamp. Today I'll show you how to create two different looks using a similar Distress Ink color palette. So let's get started. My first card was inspired by the amazingly talented Kelly Lativola and uses Distress Inks with Copic marker shading. I begin by taping a large piece of Arches hot press watercolor paper to my cutting board using painter's tape. Then I smush Distress Inks onto a scrap piece of plastic from a storage pocket that I ripped. I'm using Distress Ink in Candied Apple, Abandoned Coral, Wild Honey, and Picked Raspberry. After I smush all four colors, I spritz it with water and use my finger to move the color around to get rid of any sharp edges and changes of color. Then I pick up the plastic and press it to the watercolor paper. After getting the initial color down on paper, I can lift the plastic and re-smush it to get a little more color. I repeat the process using only Candied Apple and Abandoned Coral Distress Inks to try and tone down the bright orange in the middle of the paper. I dry it with my heat gun and then spritz the paper with water to lighten areas. Finally, I smush a little more Candied Apple and Picked Raspberry Distress Ink over the panel and let it dry. After it dries completely, I take the quilter's grid out of my MISTI and use it to help me decide how to trim the panel down. Since I used a larger piece of watercolor paper, I have several options for trimming it down to a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 panel. I like using the quilter's grid because it is see-through and allows me to see exactly what the finished panel will look like. Next, I place the trimmed panel in my mini MISTI and ink up one of the flowers from the new Even More Spring Flower stamp set with Versamark before heat embossing it with detail black embossing powder. I use a mask cut from a Post-it to mask off the flower and then stamp another flower over it. I heat emboss it with the same embossing powder and follow that process to add another flower and greenery. After my heat embossing is done, I want to add a little more visual interest to my flowers, so I find Copic markers that are a tad darker than the Distress Inks and use them to shade my flowers. I'm using R39, R37, R35, R32, and R30 Copic markers. I start with my darkest shades in the center of the flowers and where the petals overlap, and blend out to my lightest shades. I believe it is generally not recommended to use Copic markers over embossing powder, so I'm careful to keep the marker tip off of the embossing powder as much as possible. I do use Copic markers with embossed images quite often and have never had a problem with my marker tips. If any black gets on the marker, I'm able to easily scribble it off onto my scrap paper. You'll also notice that my markers are uncapped on both ends as I color. This is simply a bad habit that is really hard for me to break. When I first started using Copic markers, I had a lot of problems with the ink blooping over a project and ruining it. I went searching online for tips to avoid that and saw several recommendations to uncap both sides to equalize the pressure in the marker. However, at the time, I didn't realize they meant just to temporarily uncap both sides and then replace the chisel cap before coloring. So I've just gotten in the habit of removing both ends and I can't seem to break it. So yes, just a weird quirk of mine, no need to do it too. After I finish each image, I also add a little shading around it with a T3 Copic marker, which gives the image a little depth. It's really amazing how that shading just pops with the Distress Ink background. Kelly is an absolute genius, but I'm sure you already knew that. Once I finish coloring, I place a piece of black cardstock in my mini MISTI and stamp the sentiment from the EMPHATIC stamp set, which is a collaboration between Kathy Zielske and Simon Says Stamp. I heat emboss that with white embossing powder and trim it down to a thin label. I add a few drops of liquid adhesive to the sentiment and then use a ruler to make sure it's straight on the card panel. Finally, I add a little shimmer and shine to the flowers with my Spectrum Noir clear sparkle brush and a few drops of Nuvo Crystal Glaze. My second card uses almost the same color palette, but is definitely very different from the first. I start by stamping the flowers onto a piece of Tim Holtz Distress watercolor paper with Versamark and heat emboss them with white embossing powder. I use my post-it masks to overlap the images and continue heat embossing until I have a small arrangement at the bottom of the panel. Next, I tape that panel to a cutting board and wet it liberally with a flat brush. Then I use the same flat brush to do an ombre wash of candied apple, picked raspberry, and wild honey distress inks from the bottom of the panel towards the top. I do several layers of ink to slowly build up the color, but in general I want this card to be much softer than the first. As I paint, I overlap the colors to make sure that they blend together nicely. I also use just water to blend the top of the wild honey portion into the background. Once it dries, I add splatters of each color with a small round paintbrush. I place the scrap white cardstock over the area I want to stay mostly free of splatters. I blot them and repeat the process to get darker splatters. I also add a few spritzes of water for lighter areas. Once the panel is dry, I remove the painter's tape and trim off the edges. I place the panel in my mini MISTI and use sentiments from EMPHATIC and the new Big Thanks word set. I ink the sentiment with Versamark before heat embossing it with detail black embossing powder. I adhere the panel to a white card base and then add a few final touches with the same Spectrum Noir sparkle brush and crystal glaze. As you can see, I added the drops of crystal glaze first and then decided to add the Spectrum Noir clear sparkle brush, so I was just careful to avoid the wet drops. Once the crystal glaze drops were totally dry, it was easy enough to go back and add a little more Spectrum Noir clear sparkle to any areas that were missing it. And that's it. Two very different cards using the same colors and stamp sets. Today we're celebrating the Best Days release with a big blog hop, so head to my blog to comment and join the hop. Every stop on the hop is giving away a $25 gift card to one lucky commenter. You can find links to my blog and all of the products I used in the YouTube description below. And if you liked my video, please give it a thumbs up and click the subscribe button so you won't miss any of my future videos. Thanks so much for watching, have a fabulous day, and happy crafting! Bye!